Hi, folks. Welcome to session 3 of this harm reduction intensive series. It's great to see you all again. I don't know, it's just very exciting to continue this work with you and continue to have good conversations. I think we have some content today that is really going to get your brains moving and that people sometimes have big feelings about. So we're excited. Want to jump into the housekeeping as a reminder. Same housekeeping tips, but it's important to just kind of stay with these things, right? We invite folks to be present, have some conversation with us. As a small group, we encourage hand raising so that you can speak out loud and things like that. We can hear your voice. And so if you're able to close up the inbox and turn over the phone, I think we'll have some more good discussion today. We continue to be able to offer CE credit, so make sure you do these things. Stay in the whole time, participating in our discussions, and if we have polls, which I don't think we do today, make sure you're responding to them. Just another quick reminder, I'm not giving out any of that CE credit till the end of the series, right? So you'll get all the credit kind of all at once on one certificate. So that's why you haven't gotten any certificates from us yet. And make sure you have your camera on the whole time if you're looking for that CE credit. And if you're comfortable, we love seeing your face anyway, whether you need CE credit or not. We welcome questions and comments throughout. Don't hold your questions to the end. Let's get our needs met. If you have that question, I bet somebody else has that question too. So feel free to chime in as we go. We can use the chat for that. You can even chat one of us directly in a private message if you have a question that you're maybe feeling nervous about or shy about, and we can read your question aloud anonymously. And then once again, we drop a link each session to a course evaluation for that particular session. And so we do close those up after 2 days. And so we saw in the chat that like somebody missed the deadline. We can work with you on that. No worries, but as we go, make sure I think that for me, the best way is to like click on the eval right as you're exiting the session. That way it's up in your browser and you can get to it and keep that stuff fresh in your mind. We do have the closed captioning enabled. And if you have other requests or needs, please privately message us and we'll see how we can help you engage best. All right, our agenda for today. We're going to do a quick review, as usual, from last week's session. Want to have that content fresh in your mind as we jump into today. We'll spend quite a bit of time unpacking enabling and natural consequences, 2 buzzwords, I think, in both recovery-oriented spaces and harm reduction spaces. And we want to understand what we mean by those, or maybe even reframe those words a little bit today. We'll spend some time comparing and contrasting harm reduction approaches with abstinence-only approaches. I know that we have some folks in long-term recovery here in the room, perhaps kind of coming at this conversation through lived experience. And so we actually want to show some ways that they are not too dissimilar in some ways and talk about some of the philosophical underpinnings there. We'll talk about common criticisms that come up around harm reduction and respond to some of that. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So let's do it. Our learning objectives for today's session are, by the end of today, we hope you'll be able to explain the role of natural consequences in harm reduction practice. And then we hope you'll be able to compare and contrast harm reduction and abstinence-based recovery approaches. All right. So as a quick review, we won't spend too much time here, but wanted to be fresh for you. These are the harm reduction principles we offered last week. And we talked about some of the ways that you and I might practice harm reduction interventions differently from one another, or the interventions may be different. But I think we can rest assured that we're on the right track if we're adhering to these principles, right? If we're hanging our hat on some of these principles, I think we'll feel we're on the right track, right? And then in a housing context, I especially love to highlight practical and realistic. What are you willing to do now for yourself? And what's manageable for you? It's going to look different from other participants, right? And then accountability without termination, where we're not firing people from care simply for showing up with some of the kind of symptoms, reasons, challenges that brought them to our care in the first place. The next kind of review component we wanted to talk about is the importance of person-centered language and the role that can play in combating or intervening in that cycle of stigma that we talked about in the first session. right? And so some of the more person-centered ways of talking about our participants with our peers and our colleagues, also talking about our participants to our participants, engaging in dialogue with our participants in more person-centered ways is what we talked about. And then we spent some time exploring the way that we can broaden our harm reduction conversations, not just to drug use and not just to injection drug use, which is kind of some of the ways that harm reduction conversations unfold. But in a housing context, we're applying harm reduction principles to all kinds of high-risk behaviors in people's housing and maintaining their tenancy, in their mental and physical health, and any other high-risk behavior that somebody may be engaged in. All right, I'm going to kick it over to Andrew to talk us through housing first or treatment first.
Awesome. Hey, everybody, nice to see you again. So, we're having these conversations about harm reduction, obviously in the context of our work with folks who are in supportive housing programs, who have experienced homelessness. So I do want to talk a minute about converging kind of those two topics. So if I have any trained social workers in the room, I imagine you have seen this before. Sorry, there we go. Maslow's hierarchy of needs was this theory proposed by a guy named Abraham Maslow in 1943. He wrote this paper called A Theory of Human Motivation. And in that, he described all humans as having kind of these 5 different types of need, right? And then conceptualize them in this pyramid. So the way a pyramid works, obviously, we need to lay the foundation and these various layers upon the foundation to be able to get to the point at the top, right? So essentially at the top of this pyramid, we see self-fulfillment needs, self-actualization, things like achieving your full potential, including creative activities. Below that, your esteem needs, prestige, feelings of accomplishment, belongingness and love, your friendships, your intimate relationships, right? Those are some of our psychological needs. And at the base of the pyramid, the very bottom layer, we see our physiological needs, food, water, warmth, and rest. And just above that, our needs around safety and security. So according to Maslow's theory, we can't do things like get a job, have successful relationships with others, achieve our full potential, have hobbies, be creative, right? If we don't have our basic needs met first. So if we don't know where we're going to sleep that night, if we don't know if we're going to have a roof over our head, if we're worried that we're going to be victimized, if we're worried that we're going to experience violence, if we don't know where our next meal is coming from, then it's hard to do those other things, right? You're probably thinking right now, this is very opposite of like what we hear in American society, which is like the narrative of like, oh, you're experiencing homelessness or you have a substance use problem. Well, it's time to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and go out there and get a job, right? But that's really challenging, right? If we don't know where we're going to sleep that night, if we're not eating regularly, if we're not sheltered from the elements, et cetera. And so looking at this, when I see things like psychological and self-fulfillment needs, when we talk about changing our relationship to substances, working on our trauma, working on our mental health, right? To me, those things feel very secondary to our basic needs around having somewhere to sleep, having shelter from the elements, having something to eat, feeling safe and secure, right? So when we look at the way we've traditionally housed folks in linear residential treatment models or in kind of treatment first models, what we see is that we've kind of taken Maslow's hierarchy and flipped it on its head. We're asking folks who get into a program to manage their mental health, to stop using substances, to be on time for curfew. They got to get along with everybody else, in the shelter or in the program. They have to find a job. They've got to follow all of the rules. And then eventually we might funnel them into their own permanent housing, right? Wherever they're staying right now, where they have to kind of jump through all these hoops and follow the rules, it's a temporary situation. And folks know that. They know they're not going to be able to live there forever. And they know that they don't get access to more permanent housing unless they can satisfy all of these rules, right? If you attended our intro to low barrier housing, this is not new to you, but I did want to rehash some of this for folks who maybe weren't there, right? So what we see is like, in these types of environments where we're offering like services on site, some kind of congregate setting, right? Housing is offered as a reward for compliance with treatment. If you act the way that we want you to act, right? If you follow these rules, then eventually we'll reward you with your own place. But in the meantime, your relationship to this housing is kind of tenuous. We can kick you out at any time if you don't do what we want you to do. Essentially, what that means then is we're punishing folks for displaying the symptoms of the disorders that qualified them for treatment in the first place. If we're saying that somebody has to have a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder to get into this program, right? This program is only for people with these conditions. What happens is as soon as people step foot over the threshold, we expect them to no longer display evidence of those disorders, right? You can't be yelling and disrupting other people, right? You got to take your meds. You have to have that stuff under control, right? If we understand substance use or addiction as like a chronic relapsing disorder, we expect folks to just like magically never use drugs again because they've entered into this program, right? But realistically, that's just not how it works. And so somebody's in a program, they experience some new use, or maybe they're having some disruptive, psychiatric symptoms. And what we do is we say, you know what? It's not a good fit. You need a higher level of care. You got to go somewhere else, right? And then we end up discharging people. I don't know that I think that's ethical, saying you need to have these conditions to come here, but if we can see outwardly the way that you have these conditions, you got to go, right? To me, this is one of the main reasons that chronic homelessness exists in the first place, because we have a number of folks that are just never going to be able to do these things, right? Like not on our specific timeline and not in this specific order. I don't think that means that those folks are undeserving of housing and are undeserving of safety and stability, right? So the question then comes up around this idea of what's enabling and how are we keeping people accountable, right? If people are entering into supportive programs and not making any progress, aren't we just enabling them to kind of continue down this destructive path? Or, housing first or harm reduction don't actually hold people accountable. We hear this all the time. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about harm reduction is that we're enabling our clients to kind of continue with bad behavior, right? Or we're encouraging them in their bad decisions by not holding them accountable. So here's a quote that I love kind of like starting out this conversation with. Daniel Raymond from the Harm Reduction Coalition says, I got into harm reduction to enable people who use drugs. I enable them to protect themselves and their communities from HIV and hepatitis C and overdose. I enable them to feel like they have someone to talk to, someone who cares, someone who respects them and their humanity. I think that part's really important. I enable them to ask for help and to help others in turn. I enable them to find drug treatment and healthcare and to reconnect with their families to rebuild their lives. And I enable people who use drugs to take personal responsibility for their health and their futures. If that makes me an enabler, then I'm proud to claim that term. So I think that I've already mentioned this before. If I haven't self-disclosed this yet, I come at this work from two perspectives. I'm a person who's in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. I have found what works for me in an abstinence-only 12-step approach. But I'm real good at code switching. I'm a diehard harm reductionist by day and like a 12-stepper in the evenings, right? And one of the areas that I really see disconnect for folks who have kind of come from the abstinence-based treatment world is around this myth of the rock bottom, right? So shifting to a harm reduction approach when you're used to kind of like an abstinence only approach, this is one of the real kind of sticking points for folks. There's this myth that people who have a substance use disorder need to hit rock bottom in order to really find recovery, right? And so then the belief is that if we're practicing harm reduction, we're robbing people of that experience of the rock bottom. There's a 2018 article in the Washington Post from Maya Slavovitz, who's written a lot about harm reduction. And in it, she says, opposing harm reduction and insisting people with addiction must hit rock bottom flies in the face of reality. If making life worse for people is the best way to spur recovery, poor folks, homeless folks, and prisoners should be the most likely to succeed in treatment. But again, research shows us that people with more resources and more support actually do better, right? So one of the problems with this idea around rock bottom is that we don't know it when we're there. Rock bottom can only be determined retrospectively, right? You'll hear plenty of stories from folks, who have, entered into recovery saying like, I thought I was at rock bottom and then it got even worse, right? Even worse than that, right? And how are we as the provider supposed to measure it? If we really believe that our participants are the experts on their own experience, I certainly can't look at someone and say, that's your rock bottom, or you haven't hit your rock bottom yet. And Ryan wrote a really beautiful blog for the HFU website talking about how sometimes when we talk about this idea of like someone needing to hit rock bottom, that's really just kind of coded speak for, well, I don't think this person has suffered enough, right? You need to suffer a little bit more in order to realize what you're missing out on or what you need to change about your life, right? Rock bottom was not part of my recovery journey at all. Things weren't going great for me emotionally, but I still had a job. I still had friends. I still had relationships with my family. I had an apartment. Rock bottom is, I never went to jail. I never had to go to rehab, right? If we say that people have to hit rock bottom before things can get better, then we're actually encouraging folks to sometimes go through a lot more trauma and stress than is actually necessary. So I don't know that rock bottom to me feels like a useful tool, right? There might be a moment of awakening for some people when they've experienced certain consequences, but certainly being as down and out as possible is not going to be the best place for most people to start their recovery journey. If we have opportunities to intervene sooner and help save folks from having to go through some of that stuff, I don't know why we would choose not to do that. So kind of the next logical place we go in this conversation is like thinking about this idea of natural consequences. Harm reduction does not mean that our participants are never going to experience any consequences for their actions, right? As providers, we are not that powerful. We have to remember that when we're offering people choices, which we want to do in Housing First and harm reduction, we want to offer choice as much as possible. But choice doesn't mean unlimited choice or ultimate choice. When folks make maybe not great choices, over time, the number of choices available to them might narrow. And instead of having 7 choices, now you have 2. You get this one or this one, right? So our participants are still accountable to the consequences of their actions. If they get a job and then they show up to work high, they're probably going to get fired, right? If they're posing a threat or a continual disturbance to the neighbors in their building, they might get evicted. If they've been caught with a probation violation, we can't keep people out of jail. If they're not paying their rent, we might have to have conversations with folks around representative payee-ship. If they're in a shelter in a congregate setting and they punch somebody, they might lose their bed, right? The idea here is that we as staff are not like putting on our cape and swooping in to save the day when there's been like a hardship, right? We know that our participants become better equipped to make sound decisions in the future when they're afforded the dignity and the respect, right? The humanity to like get to practice decision making on their own, right? That's how all of us learned how to make decisions, by trial and error, right? Our participants need to be afforded with that same dignity. However, this means that change can take many months or years, right? And also it's going to entail a lot of failure, a lot of setbacks, which can be frustrating for both us and of our participants, right? And this is where we got to revert back to that really, really important question, the most important question we can ask, which is just, how can I help, right? We need to know what our participants' goals are for themselves. They're often going to be very different than the goals that we might have for them. But we ask, what are your goals? We can highlight discrepancies between someone's stated goals and their actions, right? The actions that are not in service of that goal. And we say, what is it that you'd like to do and how can I help? And then regardless of the choices that people make, we're not threatening people's housing status, right? We can certainly explain the relationship between certain behaviors and the possibility of eviction, but the conversation should never look like, you did that thing I told you not to do again, and watch, you're probably going to get evicted. Or if you do that thing again, you're going to lose your housing, right? We don't want folks to feel insecure where they live, right? We need that sense of psychological safety in addition to like our actual physical safety in order to start on that path to recovery and that path to healing. If we're going to address things like our mental health, if we're going to change our relationship to substances, we need to have like that stable foundation, right? Of Maslow's hierarchy, thinking about that pyramid. If that foundation is not stable, that other stuff at the top is not going to hold. So the way that we can kind of do that, right? Talk about potential consequences, make sure that folks are kind of understanding that their behaviors are going to have natural reactions, is by practicing this harm reduction principle that Ryan taught us about, right? Accountability without termination. So we can hold folks accountable to their actions without saying, you know what, this is a bad fit. You need a higher level of care, or this isn't the right program for you. So we don't have to terminate our relationships with folks just because something went awry, right? Our participants are going to face natural consequences for their actions. We don't have to abandon them, right? So if a participant violates their lease and they end up getting evicted, right? Their landlord says, like, I've had enough with this person, they got to go. We treat that as a normal part of the process. In a true housing first program, we'll see anywhere upwards to 30% of folks lose their first unit. A lot of times it's because they've never lived independently before. They have no idea what it means to like manage their own apartment. That doesn't need to be this like huge, painful, terrible event, right? We're going to provide folks with some interim housing, some short-term housing, a shelter bed, a safe haven bed, until another unit can be available for them. Sometimes it's not going to be available right away. Sometimes somebody who's never been housed before is going to be prioritized for that new unit first, right? But eventually, when we find a place, we're going to rehouse them, and then we're going to have these ongoing clinical conversations about, here's what went wrong the first time. How can we avoid that happening again, right? But we want these conversations, we've talked about like value neutral, right? Like we need to be as non-judgmental as possible. And then what we see is the number of people who lose their second apartment, the number is cut in half, right? If not less. So if somebody violates a lease, right, and they get evicted, we're going to relocate them. We're going to talk about what went wrong so we can prevent the reoccurrence. We're going to provide that interim shelter in the meantime and help with relocation, right? So folks are being held accountable, right? They no longer have that apartment, but we're also not saying like, we tried housing first, it didn't work, now you got to go, right? We're not terminating someone from services. We're saying, all right, we found a couple of things that went wrong. We got to go back to the drawing board and here's what we can do differently next time. Any questions about this? I know this is usually like a place where folks are like, but what? What do you have, Fiona?
I just have questions about the actual like ins and outs of that, because I think of like just figuring out like how are y'all doing it in Pennsylvania that that's possible, because I like the idea, but I think about, okay, does that mean that clients are being asked to leave but not actually getting evicted and they're agreeing to leave so that they don't have an eviction on their record? And then how are you getting them another apartment afterwards? Is it through like a housing authority? Because I'm just thinking about my clients who like their housing options come up after them being on like a housing wait list for like 5 to 10 years.
Yep.
And so it's like, yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out the logistics of that. Yeah.
So really like the biggest ingredient in our secret sauce is master leasing. So that means that Pathways is actually the leaseholder on our apartments, and we're essentially subleasing those apartments to our participants. So we don't have a voucher that's tied to one individual in one specific apartment. And then if they lose that apartment, that means they lose their voucher. So we have a lot of flexibility in being able to move somebody if there's an emergency, right? If somebody is the victim of domestic violence and we need to move them quickly, we don't have to go through a whole paperwork process. We tell the landlord, we're gonna move this person out. That's okay, we're gonna keep paying the rent until we get somebody else in there. And I know that, you know, not every program has master leasing. In fact, we work with very few programs that use master leasing. If it's an opportunity that can be explored in your system, I cannot recommend it enough, because it is really what's allowed us to be so successful in housing as many people as we do, because we've got about 550 people. Along with that, I'll say, we do not, yeah, thank you, Ryan. I was just gonna speak to this idea of like official evictions. So a lot of times a landlord will come to us and say, hey, this person that you housed in this unit is not working out, they gotta go. We'll talk to the participant and the participant will agree to leave. And then we don't have to go through a formal evictions process. Every now and then the participant is like, no, I'm not going, right? And we do have to go through a formal evictions process. However, the person who's getting evicted is Pathways, not the participant, because their name is not on the lease, right? So yes, that then avoids an eviction being on their record. And usually, because we're doing master leasing anyway, background checks, credit checks, prior evictions, all of that stuff, income verification, criminal histories, that's one of the ways that we're able to house people who have some of those barriers. So.
Gotcha, thank you, that's helpful.
Sure. Any other questions? Idea?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
So you're moving through issues rather rapidly. This is a issue that I contend with on a regular basis. We do have master lease holder, and we do sublet to individuals for SRO occupancy. But I thought I put my hand up because I wanted to, speak to the rock bottom myth. And you were moving quite rapidly, not giving much space for that. What determines the rock bottom for individuals? You mentioned one with resources does not necessarily have to hit that down and out rock bottom reality, but there are realities for everyone. One's bottom, the bottom for one is not the bottom for another, but the bottom for one might be that rock bottom, and he might be a millionaire, but circumstances that he has never experienced before, that does not put him in the gutter, that does not put him in jail, could very well be, if he's a socialite and being excommunicated from a certain circle of people, could very well be a bottom, rock bottom, causing one to realize, I gotta stop using cocaine. I gotta stop using alcohol because it causes me to be an outcast of my circle. And he's not in the gutter. That's my point.
I think you're making some good points, Ricardo. I wanted to just chime in here and say, I agree with you. That idea of the myth of rock bottom that we present here isn't to say that there isn't a rock bottom or that people don't experience rock bottom. But I think you're at a point around how do you know what it is for one person or what another? That's exactly our point, right? We don't know. It's impossible, I think, on the outside to know what your rock bottom is going to be versus what their rock bottom is going to be. And so if we're targeting rock bottom as the place that we're waiting for people to get to before a change is made, I think we're missing other time to explore change, to explore greater safety and bodily autonomy within that. So I think our point is not that rock bottom doesn't exist. It does, but that we only know about it when somebody's already moving upward after rock bottom. We only know that was rock bottom when somebody said, I hit that rock bottom. Yes, I have many resources, but yeah, I hit my rock bottom. Okay, cool. You hit your rock bottom. You're ready to make some changes. I'm ready to work with that. But if we're waiting for people to get there, I think people go through some unneeded suffering. That's our point there. Is that
So, I'm not, contending with your thinking. I just wanted to point out that someone else's bottom is not another's, and how one gets there or why one gets there doesn't really make how can I say, it doesn't matter if you
right?
get,
You're saying like if they get there, they get there. Exactly, and I agree with that. Yeah.
if the help comes, it doesn't matter where the help comes from, as long as the help comes at the right time and someone is ready, willing, open at that time. That's a window of opportunity. Rare.
Agreed. Yes, I think we all agree on that point for sure. Yes.
Now, I don't want to monopolize it, and if you tell me to Elmo, I'll hear you. I'll hear you. Where you're talking about natural and logical consequences, accountability without termination. I have a 15-bed program. I have a couple of men who have been with me for 5 or 6 years. I have one who I am, just as of yesterday, initiating a 30-day notice to quit, submitting it to the lawyer, preparing to go through the process, which entails mediation first. Always there's a mediation process before an actual judge will say yay or nay. The point is, after 6 years and 2 years of consistent, constant decompensation and evidence of one's cognitive ability to process information, take care of his small SRO space, to avoid mixing his alcohol, his benzos, his bipolar medication. Well, he's mixing medications with his alcohol, and within the past 3 months, he has been transported from his residence 4 times because he has been found in an overdosed state, in respiratory distress, and an altered mental state, had to be transported. Now, my concern is how he is treated in the ER when he decides to come, well, not decides, but when he is stabilized. And the ER versus bringing in the crisis evaluation team to determine whether or not this man should be sectioned, they see him stabilized and send him right back to the very same environment. And I'm watching this, and he's basically refusing to engage treatment. So the mediation process, I'm saying to him, you will write your own story. You write your own story. That has been my mantra for 6 years. You write your own story. Here are the community-based resources. Here, in fact, right in the same building is the intensive case management. here in the very same building is a clinical support process. And after 6 years,
Ricardo, if I may ask you, what is he being terminated for?
not because of his substance abuse, remarkably, but because he has consistently become a hazard, turning gas eyes on, leaving the gas on without an eye, without a flame. He is violating all of his sublease participant agreement, and there's an attachment, one resident responsibility. He is drinking, storing alcohol in his unit, alcohol, drugs, paraphernalia. That is an automatic
Let me jump in here,
dischargeable
Ricardo.
offense. He's been here 6 years.
Yeah,
Living
it's a
situation.
complicated story. I think ultimately, if I were to distill some of the story that you're sharing, and bring it into the conversation along those lines of accountability without termination, I think you're saying, I think what I hear you saying is that
10
at
years up
some
there.
point there is a termination, right? At some point, termination may have to happen.
And I'm still
and-
trying to help him with the mediation.
Yep.
I'm
I
not
don't think
trying
you're-
to see him on the street. I'm
Yeah.
trying to see him at the appropriate level of care.
I think that's appropriate. I don't think that is in contradiction with what we're presenting here. I will position us here at Pathways we are the highest level of community-based care. We offer ACT team services. For us, there is no higher level of care, right? So I wanted you to be clear about our position in the
outside of an inpatient setting.
Right.
Yeah.
Community-based. Yep. And so I don't think that what you're describing is anything different than we would do, right? What I'm not hearing you say is that you have specific, like, oh, 3 strike, you're not hitting them with a 3 strike policy, right?
No.
Which cannot be like, that's not individualized enough, right? You've been with him for 6 years. I don't think that what you're saying is in conflict with this accountability without termination piece. And so the way that we would operate in that case, because we're a different setup than you, obviously, is we would probably discharge them from housing for some period of time and maintain social services, maintain the case management. And I think the key here is that we continue to provide support so that people aren't just like dropped from care. And I hear in your response that you're doing that too. You continue to provide support. And I like your mantra of you write your own story, right? That is reflective of this idea of there are consequences that will happen. These are consequences that, like, not even us, not even we can protect you from out there in the world. At some point, those choices become limited, as Andrew talked about. Yeah, I can hear in your story too that you wrestle with this quite a bit. And if I'm hearing it correctly, I'm hearing like an empathy for, like, I don't want to have to do this, but it's become a safety problem for other people in the house. And so when people's self-determination start to infringe on the safety of others, that is
on the right.
Yeah.
Impinging on the right to peaceful enjoyment of this congregate living space of others. When his behavior starts to impinge on the right of others to enjoy the living space, then I have to think about a larger community other than just his small SRO and his head.
I agree with you. Let me call Elmo on this one now.
Very good. I was
thank you.
waiting on that.
Oh, we have so much to talk about, so many slides. I'm glad you brought it to our attention as a group, because I think all of us will continue to wrestle with that idea. Like, where is the line? Is there a line? How do we provide support in an ongoing way if we don't want to terminate? That's a thing that we can all continue to wrestle with now that those ideas are out there through this conversation. So we thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'll say if you're waiting this whole training series for the slide that says, here are the things, here are the specific instances and reasons to evict someone, that slide is never coming, because everything we're doing is individualized, right? Ricardo is talking about 6 years of challenges with someone before a 30-day notice has come about, right? We've seen similar situations where we've put up with a whole lot, and then the 30-day notice comes around from us, and suddenly people are like, oh, all right, I'm going to stop doing that because I don't want to lose my place, right? But because the services we provide are so individualized, because everyone has different barriers, different resources, different histories, different traumas, different backgrounds, right? There are very few if X then Y type situations that we're ever going to be able to advise on, right? Certainly one of the kind of like no tolerance things is violence towards a staff member, right? But beyond that, we've pretty much seen just about everything else you can imagine and continue to work with people. I want to make space for Brandon real quick, because you had unmuted a while ago. Looks like you wanted to jump in with a question.
Hey, thank you. It was, similar idea as maybe different circumstance, but I also have a participant who has received a 30-day notice, and it's, he just he's got mental illness, and I don't think he connects the reality of, how serious that could be. I think he has a little bit of a disconnect, unfortunately, and it just makes it difficult to try to relate the levity of the situation to him. And I just didn't know, I guess it's basically the same idea, but I just didn't know if there was any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of relationship building when somebody feels really safe with you and like they're not going to be judged, being in a place where you can have these very straightforward and honest conversations. And yeah, sometimes folks are just not going to relate to what we're saying. We see that quite often, right? Folks' substance use or folks' mental health or other challenges just kind of interfering with perception in a way that they don't relate to the possible consequences of certain behaviors, right? And sometimes the only way that those become real for folks is when they start to feel some of those consequences. Certainly we're not gonna shoot straight to like, let's evict this person and now they have to go live on the street again because they didn't listen to what we said. But again, we can't put on our cape and save folks from all of the potential consequences, right? So sometimes the way that we get better at decision making is by feeling some of the impacts of the decisions that we've made. And so, yeah, it's a hard question to answer because there isn't a concrete line necessarily. But I just want to affirm that like you're not alone in that, and that's something that we're challenged with among our participants all the time.
Hey, thank you. I just if I can share just a quick funny anecdote from that client. I've tried, because this landlord he has threatened. The landlord's got his own issues and is difficult to deal with. But starting last year, when he first got his first 30-day notice, I started trying to suggest to him that he save a little money each month towards a vehicle. And his only response to me was, "Okay, Dad."
I've been called dad by many a client, many a client in my day. I think sometimes maybe it's affectionate and sometimes it's derogatory. It depends on who it's coming from. That's great. All right. I'm going to speed through this. I got a blog I can send you where I really talk through this stuff in a little bit more detail, but I do want to point out some of the overlap. Oh, it skipped my last slide. I think a lot of us come from a background, right, of like abstinence only, 12-step stuff, like this is the way it worked for me. This is the way that it works, right? And we're really pitting 12-step recovery or abstinence-based recovery and harm reduction as polar opposites. I want to present some ways in which I think they're quite similar and have a lot of overlap. I think this can be really useful in conversation sometimes. So one of the first things you're going to hear if you go to a 12-step meeting is the third tradition of NA or AA, which says like the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking or stop using, right? So if somebody shows up at a meeting and they're wasted, they don't get kicked out. they're allowed to sit and stay. And then folks will say, we hope you'll come back again next time. Maybe next time you'll come back sober, right? To me, this is not at all dissimilar from this idea that we have in harm reduction of just like radical acceptance of anybody who walks through the door, right? It's the idea that we're going to meet people where they're at, right? But also we like to say meet people where they're at, but don't leave them there either, right? And so we're welcoming folks with open arms, no matter how they show up. And we want to help start seeking to help people address their own needs in a way that feels non-judgmental, right? In a way that is without precondition. And the hope there is that we can promote some kind of regular engagement through relationship building with people, right? We're not going to build very effective relationships if we're saying, you know, you need X, Y, and Z to be in a relationship with us. You need X, Y, and Z to come get services from us. It's like, no, you walk through the door and you say you need help, we're going to help you. That's something we're going to see in both a 12-step fellowship and an NA or an AA meeting and a harm reduction program. Anybody who walks through the door is welcome here in whatever state you're in. Let's see. My next one is we talk a lot in 12-step fellowships about the therapeutic value of one addict helping another, right? Really peer-based relationships. Whereas we also know in any harm reduction program, peer support is like one of the keystones of effective treatment. The best harm reduction programs have been informed in their development by the people most impacted by the problem, right? Programs that employ folks with lived experience of homelessness, of managing psychiatric disabilities, of managing their relationship to substances. We know that peer specialists can have really special, meaningful relationships with our participants that sometimes don't happen with staff that don't have that lived experience, right? In either case, it's less about telling people what to do and more about, this has been my experience, here's what I found worked for me, right? It's the idea of like attraction rather than promotion, right? It's not a prescriptive, here's the treatment plan you need to follow. It's here are some tools and resources that I've used. Let me help you if you would like access to these things as well. But it's more relationship and peer-based than it is kind of like top-down. Here's the list of things that you need to accomplish in this order in order to get better, right? So we're not placing explicit demands on behavior. It's rather making suggestions or offering our own experience to help people with their decision-making process moving forward. So again, this is also an area where we're looking at like really individualized help and, sharing that kind of like sincere investment in like, I want to provide you with these resources to help increase your safety and to help increase your bodily autonomy and well-being. When we start thinking about the 12 steps, right? If you're familiar with the 12 steps at all, I don't find this dissimilar in ways from the trans theoretical model or the stages of change, right? Step one in an AA, NA program, right? We admitted we were powerless over alcohol or our addiction and that our lives had become unmanageable. To me, that sounds like I'm starting to consider that maybe that I have a problem, right? That's our contemplation stage. Step two, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I think this translates to the preparation stage, maybe acknowledging that we need some outside help with the problem, right? Preparing ourselves to ask for that help or figure out where we can obtain some of that help or support. And then step three is about turning our will and our lives over to a higher power, right? And that, I think that's our action step. That's the actual act of saying, I need some help. I can't do this on my own, right? So I really see a parallel between these two things. It's acknowledging something's going on. It's hard for me to manage independently, right? We know that recovery happens in community with other people. It doesn't happen in isolation, right? That's where we hear phrases like an addict alone is in bad company, or you can't spot self-deception, right? So it's this idea that we need to reach out to other people for support in order to make some changes, right? it's hard to do on our own. The last one I want to bring up is this idea of like incremental change, right? So in the rooms, we'll hear things like take the steps, right? One day at a time. We talk about first things first, right? It's not like this overnight miracle that happens. You enter into the rooms and suddenly you're sober and then everything is great, right? It's like an incremental process of change, which is not dissimilar from what we see in harm reduction, where we're celebrating any positive change, right? Any step towards greater health and wellness is something that we want to celebrate, right? As humans, like we like when we do things well, we like that sense of achievement, of mastery, right? So we talk about the small steps, right? The little things that we can do. Can we get one day, right? And as we achieve those kind of smaller steps, it makes those longer term goals feel more achievable, right? Are things like housing stability and re-engaging with our friends and our family and community, being self-supporting, having freedom from trauma, and maybe achieving abstinence is one of those possible goals, right? But we look at how do we help folks incrementally move towards greater health and wellness, greater safety, greater bodily autonomy, right? It's not just you're using and then now you're going to get sober and you're never going to use again. That's a huge leap for folks to take, right? Instead, we break those goals down into piece by piece and eventually move folks in that direction of greater health and well-being. I'm going to jump back over to Ryan to talk about some criticisms and ethics around harm reduction. I want to say I know we're running short on time. It's possible we'll go a few minutes over. If you have to bounce right at 3:30, please feel free to do so. We're recording this. You'll have access to that, but do want to continue the discussion and not cut us off.
So some very common criticisms that come up around harm reduction, and these are not necessarily housing focused questions. They are kind of just broad harm reduction things, especially from people who maybe are not really connected to the harm reduction world. It's an unusual or different sort of approach. So this first one, and we have referenced this one already in the training series, but it encourages drug use or other risky behavior, right? Like by making it safer for people to engage in what they're engaging in, it encourages them to do more of it. It encourages even fresh people who haven't been doing that risky behavior to jump in. And in fact, the literature supports the opposite. The reality is, especially as we're thinking about drug use, people are more likely through harm reduction work to engage in treatment options, more traditional treatment options, as well as things like medication for opioid use disorder, right? And so harm reduction can serve as a gateway for people to explore abstinence-based recovery or just alter their relationship with substances through the kind of non-judgmental, autonomous type approach that we're suggesting here. Another common criticism is that harm reduction sends mixed messages. Is it okay to use drugs? Is it not okay to use drugs? You know, that we're sort of like pretending that the risks aren't real for people, right? And the reality is that this sort of thinking really ignores the practicality piece, like what's realistic for me may not be realistic for you. It ignores self-determination and really meeting people where they are as an individual, right? That person-centered approach. Another common criticism is that harm reduction fails to get people off substances or inspire change. I already said in an earlier point that, in fact, many people do change their relationships to substances as a result of harm reduction practice because those treatment options are available. It's part of the conversation. But further, abstinence is not the primary goal. Not everybody wants, will achieve, has even any desire to achieve abstinence. We're recognizing various places on the continuum of use or the continuum of risky behavior as valid, legitimate. Many of my friends, family members use substances in ways that are healthy or in ways that they continue to kind of live a life that many people would describe as quote unquote normal, right? And so abstinence isn't the primary goal here in this work. Although an individual may decide abstinence is their primary goal, right? And that's cool too. We'll roll with that too. Another common criticism, and you often hear this from like law enforcement types as they get called out to scenes and are reacting to overdose. People repeatedly using Narcan are abusing the system, right? There are folks who have been reversed a number of times from overdose, right? And so, you know, the reality is that Narcan, naloxone, this was developed for the purpose, the express purpose of reversing overdoses and to save lives. That was why it was made. And so when people's overdoses are reversed, that's the medication doing its job. It's doing what it was meant to do. And we think that's a good thing. Saving of lives will always be a good thing in our minds. It's a good thing if it happens one time, and it's a good thing if it happens 37 times. And I don't believe that we get to decide, any of us get to decide, those of us who have access to Narcan and are using it, who deserves another chance at life and who doesn't. Those are the criticisms. I see your hand up, Nathaniel, please join in.
I mean, the classic analogy to Narcan is bypass surgery, right? That there are many more people alive today with heart disease because of bypass surgery. And like, would you rather that had not been invented?
Right. They're abusing the Doritos too much, and they shouldn't have another heart bypass surgery, right? I love that. I love that other analogy. That's great. Yeah, and I'm seeing in the chat, that could be the time that brings them to start their recovery journey. That 37th time may inspire a change in relationship to substances, or perhaps a move towards an abstinence-based recovery if that's what they want. Thank you for sharing that, folks. I wanted to also kind of call up this quote. Perhaps you've heard this in like social services type work before. I've heard it, especially in like DNA type settings, kind of more traditional outpatient type settings, for example. I can't help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves. And our former director of nursing, Kate Gleason-Bachman, had a kind of strong response to that sentiment, right? I want to read Kate's response. It's ridiculous to think someone doesn't want to help themselves. I think if you're saying that about someone, you've not really listened to them. You've not met them where they are. You've not done the work of understanding what's happening for them. When people come to you, even someone who's wanting to harm themselves, they're looking for a way to get relief. They're trying to help themselves in the way that makes sense for them at that time. Our role is to help people from that place where they are and help them figure out how they can take steps to help themselves. We help make them safer, help protect them, and help get them to where they want to be. A kind of key thing that we want to kind of add on to Kate's quote here, right, is that change is not a sort of a visible process always. We don't always get to see what's happening inside for someone. And so it may be that somebody is moving in the direction of change and we're just not aware of it yet, right? We're not able to judge people's desire to change, and we can't expect change to occur on our timelines. And that's very common for like nonprofit work or whatever. You got a window of time that you could do treatment, and so it's got to happen in this time. That's not realistic. That's not meeting people where they are. Rather, we can engage people in this conversation we've talked about already. This discrepancy between what they say they want and what's going on for them now, right? And the reality is that people do want to help themselves. They may not have the tools to do it, or their goals may be different from the ones that we think that they should be. Right? Along the lines of
work harder than someone else.
I've heard that one too. Something that my colleague Khalil, who just came over to our training team and from the clinical teams, has said that really strikes a chord with me is I've needed people to work harder than me at times. That was crucial for me in my life. And so I think if we have that space, we can work harder than people. Although I'm not sure that the work that we're describing is equivalent, right? I think people are working hard. We have value judgments about what that is and what it looks like. I'm going to hit you with this slide. You're going to be super mad at me for this slide because we could dig in for 3 hours on just this slide, probably. I want to hit you with it, and then maybe consider putting in the additional comments in the course evaluation, like if there's one of these that aligns with your thinking or you're wrestling with one of these ethical issues, because I don't know that we have time. We don't have time to pick it apart right now. But if people are feeling that there is one they want to pick apart, let's bring it up in another one of our sessions. Okay. So the first one is it ethical to educate people on safer use practices? Doesn't that just like keep people locked in and they'll keep going and going and going, right? Is it ethical to help people develop ideal use plans? In other words, like safer, and this is the most ideal way to use, right? Alongside people, with Narcan there, with clean needles, or in a certain safe space, right? Is it ethical to even do that? Around the idea of tenancy and maintaining a unit, an ethical concern around, should we be teaching people to keep a low profile from their landlords, let's say? Should we be helping them do that, stay off their landlord's radar? Another one, repeated overdose education and safety planning, right? It kind of goes along with that common criticism we saw. They keep having overdoses and we keep doing overdose education and safety planning. Is it ethical to keep doing that without, quote unquote, stopping that in some way, right? Is it ethical to instruct people not to use alone? Because when we're doing that, we're actually encouraging more people to use, all right? That one comes up. Money management for substance use, right? So people kind of arrive at the end of the month with no money left to feed themselves or pay their rent or do whatever. And is it ethical to help them manage their money so that they can keep using while also feeding themselves? And then the last one, and I think this speaks to Ricardo's challenges that he wrestles with on a regular basis, is harm reduction ethical in a congregate setting, right? Where it's not just one person in a scattered site, in a unit by themselves, but when there are perhaps families present or roommates present, and when one person's autonomy interferes with another person's well-being, the ethics around that. So before you raise your hands and yell at me that we didn't dive into these all the way, perhaps let's consider, are there ones of these that are really hitting you and you want to wrestle with, and we can bring them to a future session? So please add that to your comments on the course eval. All right, we're five. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, yeah, we're 4 minutes over. I dropped the evaluation for today in the chat. Dre, I did open up last week's evaluation so you can get yours in there. I saw early on you said you missed it. So if anybody else missed session, what's today? Today's session 3? If anybody else missed session 2, that eval is back open in case you need it. I don't want to drop it in the chat and make it too confusing. You'll have it in your email. Yeah. Any other questions or final thoughts from folks? Ricardo, appreciate, and Nathaniel and Brandon, Fiona, everybody who kind of brought their questions and ideas today. It's great to hear from y'all and hear how this stuff is coming up, what you're thinking about. We want these sessions to be useful and applicable to the work that you're doing. So please don't be shy about your questions. We really love to hear them.
Thank you.
We done?
We're all done.
All right.
We did it.
I'm
Thanks.
gonna go find me an Elmo.
Go
Thank
give
you,
Elmo a hug
guys.
for me.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rebecca. Talk to you soon.
Yes, sir.